talking about hobbies and with an absolutely superb speaker. And I've known Joel Stone now for...
Come on, don't go there.
You won't go there. What's weird is we met in a student-teacher relationship. He took a class that I taught.
I was sitting there.
Yeah, in this room. And by far, Joel has been one of the most exceptional historians I have the privilege to know, and he probably knows more about history than I do. He is now the curator of the Dawson Great Lakes Museum, which is part of the Detroit Historical Museum, and we'll let you give a plug for what's going on downtown. He is a boater himself. He is fascinated always with maritime history. In fact, when he took my class, he did a great overview on the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum up in the Upper Peninsula. So, would you like to learn about boats? Please welcome Joel Stone.
Thank you, Lorraine. It was a pleasure to be invited here. Living history museums I grew up on them. I think my mom and dad had me into every one this side of the Mississippi and most of the other ones on the other side too. So coming to these things is how I really got a love for history and a real appreciation for them. And frankly, I wish we had something like that. The closest we can come to the streets of old Detroit in the basement. You know, not quite the same thing as what you've got here. So it's a wonderful thing. We're going to be talking about models, mostly model ships, because the Dawson, in fact, was started by model shipbuilders. Because we're talking about boats, we've got a blue theme tonight. I think we're losing some of the color in the... There we go. So this is going to be kind of tough to see, but I'll talk you through it. You're looking at basically the main hall of the Dawson Museum, and along there are a whole series of models. We were started by the Great Lakes Modeling Guild in the JT Wing, and this is that color picture of the JT Wing I was telling you about. JT Wing was the last working schooner on the Great Lakes, and when its time was done, it had already sunk about 4 times in various places from Newfoundland to the Marine City, and the people that owned it, the Piggott Company, Piggott family turned it over to the museums of the city of Detroit, and they turned it into a maritime museum. And it was a great learning tool. It was down on Belle Isle. Here's a picture of Belle Isle, maybe a little bit hard to see. Here's Belle Isle Bridge here, and here is the flower house here, the Carillon, and here, tucked into a lagoon of all of its own, is the JT Wing. And started by 3 different organizations, essentially. The Detroit Historical Commission was very involved in it. The Great Lakes Model Shipbuilding Guild was very involved in it, and then the Great Lakes Maritime Institute was the third of the 3. But essentially, we were started by modelers. So from the very beginning, we've had a wonderful collection of models in our museum. That first picture showed it. This was Captain Johnson. Captain Joseph Johnson was a skipper on the Great Lakes for years, and then he retired and became the curator of the museum. And you can see right here, he's actually working on a model. And any guys who have done any work with moldings and things like that, you buy a tool that's got a bunch of little spikes in it, and you can push it in, and it gives you a perfect mold of what that is. Well, that's basically what he's got. He's got a tool that has different pieces of wood that slide over, and he can get a perfect read on what the model to the right is. From the very beginning, 1951, we started publishing a magazine called Telescope. And Telescope was basically news about the Great Lakes and news about model shipbuilding specifically. Each issue featured a model. It had drawings that were in the model. It had all the specifications. This issue might have had the basic plans. The next issue would have, what the pilot house looked like and broke it down very carefully. We're still publishing the Telescope. The Model Shipbuilding Guild basically went out of business when the Dawson Museum was opened. We went from the JT Wing in the schooner, lasted for about 6 years, and then it was just so rotten that they had to burn it. It was so rotten it took forever to burn. They then scraped the place clean, and that spot you saw where the JT wing was sitting was filled in, and that's where the Dawson now sits. Once the Dawson was there, the model shipbuilders kind of became the Great Lakes Maritime Institute, which is also still operational as a 501c3. The talk tonight, basically we're going to talk about a general overview of where model ships specifically, kind of fit into our culture. We'll talk a little bit about the art of modeling, and I should say that I'm not a modeler. I have built models, and I finished most of them. That was always the hardest part, is you'd get it started and then it would sit down on your dad's workbench and you'd never quite get around to putting the sails on it or putting the wheels on it. I finished most of them and had a good time doing it, so I have a real appreciation for it. But it's one of those hobbies that was a lot more popular before television came along. And I don't mean that disparaging of television, but it's a hobby you can do while you're listening to the Tiger game. You can't do it while you're watching the Tiger game. It's one of those things, and adults did it, kids did it. In fact, Detroit was really where a lot of modeling got started, and I'll mention that a little bit later. But it was, as a hobby, it was a real big thing in the city here. Modeling traditions go way back. This is an Egyptian burial model, because that's essentially how they first got started. They were ceremonial models that were built to be buried with people, usually people who owned a boat or owned a fleet of boats. The Phoenicians did it, the Egyptians did it, the Romans and Latins did it. They also did it up in Scandinavia. The Scandinavians did them out of gold. They did them over in the South Seas. You know, they'd put in a model of an outrigger canoe in a burial mound. So model shipbuilding goes way back, and it's been it was a serious thing at that point. It's kind of turned into a hobby since. Serious also were the models that were built mainly through the Scandinavian countries as a Thanksgiving thing. So if a mariner was stuck in a storm and he prayed to God and they were saved, then he would build a model of his ship and he would take it to the church and they'd hang him in the church. If you go over to Denmark, you go to the Netherlands, very often you walk into the churches and there are models of ships hanging in port towns. And they did this also in America. It was a tradition that we adapted to America. So if you go into some of the real old churches in Boston or over in New England, you will often find models hanging from the ceiling. It later became much more of a serious business commitment. It became kind of the contract between a shipbuilding firm and the company that was paying for it. And this is where something like this would come in handy. They'd build a half model, and it didn't include any of the superstructure. That they'd have drawings for, that would show where the staterooms were and where the cabins were and all of the mechanics. But this essentially told whoever was buying the boat what their hull would look like. And this really became kind of the contract. I mean, it was a handshake type deal. And from this, they could take all their loftings. And loftings is where you take a measurement along a certain line. And very often these were made in strips, so that they'd take like a half-inch strip, and each strip would be, make a line, and then you would take all your measurements all the way down, and you can get a real clean feel for what the finished boat's going to look like. That tradition kind of was carried on over time. Not only would the model become the contract, but then they would often make a very, very fancy model that would be kind of a gift to the maker. This is a different kind of a model. This is a plating model. Kind of hard to see. This is the front end of a freighter. And in ink on the model, they've marked what each of the steel plates would have to look like, so that when they would take a model like this and they'd take it over to the metal shop and they'd hand it off to the guys in the metal shop, who would then cut out the steel plates and put them on these. These models were really lucky to have. There are very few of these around. This was from the Great Lakes Engineering Works downriver. And when they were closing glue in, I guess, the late 50s, 55, 58, Great Lakes Engineering Works is where the Edmund Fitzgerald came from, the William Clay Ford the Homer. When they were closing that up, you know, it's an old factory. They'd started a bonfire and they were throwing all their plans on the fire, they were throwing all their models on the fire. You know, anything that wasn't a tool that could be reused was getting thrown on this massive bonfire, and somebody had the wherewithal and a station wagon and grabbed a couple of these, because the full model is about 9 feet long. I mean, it's done to a beautiful scale. This model actually represented 3 different boats. They built 3 different boats from the loftings for this model. So that's real nice to have.
Were those flat metal or were those any kind of concrete?
This was a half model, kind of like that one, made out of pine.
Chunks of metal.
And then the chunks of metal would be flat. Yeah, they would be plates that they would put on a frame. Oh yeah, they'd have to contour them. This would kind of give them an idea of what kind of contour they were. Of course, when you're talking about a sheet of metal that's this big on a ship that's 600 feet long, the contours are very gradual, so they can work those in. But they'll roll those in beforehand and then they put them on. And that kind of gave them an idea where, you know, because some of them, the side of the ship is flat. Bottom of the ship is flat. It's some of the turns and those kinds of the bow and the stern there that they would do that. So, and I should mention that right now we've got the exhibit that I kind of built this presentation off of is at the Dawson Museum, and the Dawson's open on the weekends 11 to 4, and we've probably got 160 models in our collection, and my goal for the whole thing was to get as many models as I could in the museum, and I think I got up to about 110. There just wasn't room to get them all out. But this one's up there, and you can see that one. And you'll have to go to the museum to see this one too. It's a beautiful builder's model for the Greater Detroit and the Greater Buffalo, which were the final ships that were built by the D&C line. Beautiful, you know, 450-foot side wheelers, spectacular vessels. And this one, in fact, is the builder's model that, again, was used as the contract. This showed the people who were buying it, and the interior it's a cutaway. So you can actually look into the interior and see what the main salon looks like. You can look at the interior and see what the dining space is, what the engine, what all of those things.
Let's try something here.
Oh, we can do that too. That's a great idea.
Somebody in the back said.
Don't move.
Holy smokes. I'm not moving.
No, set it down. Go ahead. Go ahead. We must have just pulled the right thing.
Whoa.
All right.
You want to flip back?
Let me back up a bit here.
I don't know.
It's not working. All right. Let's start at the beginning. All right, here. There's the inside of the Dawson. And you can see that along those walls, you know, both walls and down the center, it's all models. It's nothing but models there. There's the JT Wing. Beautiful ship sitting in a dry dock, dry rotting as fast as it possibly could. There's the picture of Belle Isle, again with the boat club up at the top and the flower house over here, and there's the JT Wing on its own little island. Captain Johnson doing his measurements of a hull, half hull there. He actually lived on the boat with his cat. He had a great time. That would have been a wonderful way to retire. His wife died just before they put the boat in, and there's the telescope. There's the kind of plans we included with the telescope. Here's what we're going to talk about. Here's the funerary models. Wood, the earliest ones were wood, but again, they eventually got into metal. There's the hanging from the ceiling in the church model. There are the half hulls, and these actually are the half hulls of the D&C boats. The bottom one would be the Frank Kirby. When D&C went out of business, we were really lucky. The JT Wing got put in there in 1949. D&C went out of business, well, they stopped running in 50. We're out of business by 56. Glue, Detroit Shipbuilding, all of those things were closing just as we opened our museum. So we were really lucky. The timing was good. A lot of things came into us at that point. Here's the plating. You can see the full model across the top, and then you can see how they mark where the plates all go. That's all just done on ink on enamel.
Joe, how big is the average metal plate on the freezer? Are they smaller?
Oh no, they're probably 12 feet by 6 feet. Yeah, and that is small, because imagine how many you got to do a 1,000-footer. So, this is the builder's model of the Greater Detroit, and you can see how it's cut away. So you can see the boilers, you can see how the paddle wheels operated. You know, this is what you can see on the inside. And if you look, and I didn't realize this, somebody pointed this out, a kid pointed this out. It takes a kid who's this tall. If you look up, the ceiling is painted. And it's painted exactly like it's supposed to be, because we've also got, we inherited the watercolors that came from the designer of the ship. So we know exactly what it was designed to look like, and they put the whole thing in just as it was. This is another beautiful model that we've got in our front lobby, the Paramarquette 18. And this one was used for 2 boats, because the Paramarquette 18 ran for about a year and sank in Lake Michigan. And they just went back to the company that built it and said, just do the same thing. So they built the thing again, and it's spectacular in that every window has little curtains in it. If you look inside the pilot house, you know, all of the instruments carved in brass are set into the pilot house like that. The windows aren't painted on. In fact, you'll see that in the next one. You know, they actually have mullions. They've actually been, you know, set like American hung windows, proper sills, you know, the piping around the name on the front. Even if you look at the railings, you know, the way a railing is built with a little knob that the rest of the railing goes through. I mean, it's spectacular that the detail that they worked into these things. And once they got them done, this model actually, once the ship was built, sailed successfully, they gave it to the company, the Paramarquette Railroad Company, and it sat in the front, in the lobby of their office. You know, so it all of a sudden became an artwork that they could be proud of, and really elevated that, you know, this beautiful piece of art to something that everybody could see. This great model. This model was a model that Frank Kirby and his company built. Frank Kirby was a Detroit naval architect who built all kinds of boats, everything from the Boblo boats to the Lansdowne, and most of the DNC boats going back, I think, to the city of Detroit too, back in the 1880s. Real influential as far as, you know, everything from screw propellers to paddle wheels. He liked paddle wheels. He said the ride was much better on a paddle wheeler for passengers. They really appreciated that. This was kind of experiments that he did with icebreakers. This was the St. Marie that ran up between the lower and upper peninsula up at Mackinac, very much like the Chief Wawatam. This is the model, the way we got it when the company closed. And we sent it to some model builders, and they actually, you know, put all the stacks back on it, put the windows in, got it all cleaned up. And this model, in that condition, was meant to be an icebreaker. It was a great idea. He had seen 2 tugboat captains. One tugboat got stuck in the ice, so the other tugboat captain pulled his boat up nose to nose, and they tied off that way. And by turning one propeller forward and one propeller backwards, they were able to pull, you know, the water out from under the ice cracked, and they were able to break free. And Frank Kirby said, what a great idea. So what he did is not only put a propeller on the back, he put a propeller on the front, and that's how icebreakers generally work today. You know, they do ride up and crush the ice, but before they do that, they've got a propeller that sucks the water out from under the ice cracks of its own accord, of its own weight, and then they can ride up on top of it. It's already broken, and it's easy to do. Frank Kirby developed that, and developed this whole idea of getting train cars back and forth across the strait, and the Tsar found out, the Tsar found out about it, Nicholas. And up, you know, north of St. Petersburg there, he needed the same type of thing. He invited Kirby over. Kirby took this model with him to Russia and convinced the Tsar that this is exactly what they needed up in the Baltic there, and the Tsar actually built Kirby his own shipyard over in Russia. The model came back, ended up on a shelf, probably came real close to ending up in that bonfire, and, you know, luckily the timing was good. We got the model, we've been able to save it, and it's a model with a wonderful story. This is also a builder's model, but one built specifically for art. This looks very much like the Barlam, but not enough to be a builder's model. This was meant to be a gift to the owner. You know, it's a beautiful model made out of maple. You know, it's all maple, hardly even detailed. You can see that the windows are merely painted on, and everything else on it has been chromed. So you've either got the maple or you've got the chrome. It really is more of a piece of art than it is a working tool for a shipbuilder. And in fact, there's a lot of art that goes into shipbuilding. One of the first things that happened as far as hobbying goes was the hobby of putting ships in bottles. It's things that sailors did either when they were on the boat and they were really bored and they weren't doing scrimshaw, or after they had stopped sailing and they were home and they needed something to keep them busy and out of their wife's hair. They would come up with things like this, which were really small and easy to do. The whole model's maybe this long, so the material costs nothing. They'd use sails, they'd use old shirts for the sails, they'd use rose petals for the sails, they'd use anything that was flat they could get to the right shape, and they'd use those things. And the whole trick, of course, to the ship in the bottle is how do you get a model that's that big into the thin little nose of the bottle. The trick to it, and everybody knows it, so I'm not giving away any secrets, is they would build it standing. And then you can see right at the bow, there are these forestays that come down. And they would come down to holes in the bowsprit, and those little threads would keep going, and they'd be real long. And they would lay all of the masts down so that the thing was very, very small. They'd slide it into the bottle and set it into some kind of medium that would hold it upright. And once it was set, they'd pull on those threads. Those forestays would pick all those masts up and everything would be in position. And then they'd slice them off so you couldn't tell how they did it. And ships in the bottle, we've got the same type of thing for the Great Lakes. And some of them get real fancy. They put in water. We've got one that's got a whole town set into the side of a mountain. Which that takes a lot of work to get that stuff in there and then get the ship in on top of it. The hobby aspect kind of developed beyond that. Early toys, there were toys that you could probably get early on of ships. Something either somebody in the neighborhood made or you made yourself. Modeling kind of took off around 1900, 1910, 1920. This is a pond model, which meant that you'd put it in some body of water that you could recover it in. And they actually had races. There's a whole series of folks here that are setting up to go racing. This is on Belle Isle. There's a pond on Belle Isle just down from the Dawson. It's still there. It's still usable. I've never seen anybody with a boat in it. I do hear that they run the boats at one of the apartment complexes down here, either along Wattles. There's a big lake, and you'll often see models there. But these guys, there was a guy named Archer, lived in Royal Oak, and he figured out that if you sold people a kit, they were more likely to do it. So he'd sell you the plans, he'd sell you all the wood you needed to put the thing together, and he'd sell you all the little tiny hardware. And he really got into the pond model business. There are lots of companies around that do this. There's a company called Blue Jacket that I think's been around for 100 years, and you can still get their catalogs. I got them as a kid, and I feel like ordering one of them just for old time's sake. But you can buy all the barrels that are this big and all the wheels that are this big and the portholes. You can get all that stuff. So Archer was big in getting it started. To briefly get off of boats, Detroit was also kind of the home of the beginning of model airplanes, too. A guy named Bill Stout, who worked for Ford for a long time and then worked for himself. Great inventor. One of those little-known guys in Detroit that everybody should know exactly what he did. We all know the trimotor. He was basically put the first fixed-wing metal plane in the air, and he did so many more things. He did cars, he did buses, he did trains, he did all kinds of inventing. But one of the things he was really into was airplanes. And he figured that if you get kids into it early, then they'd start to understand all of the aerodynamics, besides being able to concentrate on some of the building and just the measuring and that kind of stuff. And so he actually got together with the Detroit News and sponsored a contest, which they first held at Ford Airport, and then they took it to City Airport, and it was open to students across the city, and they would sell you. He got a company to put together a series of models, and you could buy the kit, put it all together yourself, and then they'd have a contest to see whose model would fly the fastest. And some of them were rubber band powered, most of them were rubber band powered at that time, but they got really accurate, sort of the point where he could take these kids to conferences, big conference hall where he had to give a talk, and he'd march the kids in, and they'd fly the planes down the middle of the hall, the banquet hall. They had a good time, and he really got it started, and that's kind of where model airplane building came from there. Model cars, oddly enough, while we were big into the car business, we only had 2 companies in town that made model cars, plastic model car kits that we always grew up with before Revell really took over that market. But so hobby models became a real important part, and we've got this model. Just before we opened the exhibit, this guy came and donated it to us, and it's just in beautiful shape. He admits that his dad probably did 3/4 of the work on it, but he had the fun sailing it. And we've still got ship plans available. We've got the plans that were drawn by the folks at the Model Shipbuilding Guild. We've got some of the Archer plans, and we make those available to people all the time. And by using these models, you can lay a piece of wood along these lines and tell whether you've got the shape right. The whole process, modeling is kind of tedious, which is maybe why people have gotten away from it. Our attention spans have gotten a little bit shorter. But it takes a long time just to get the hull right. And if you think about it, the hull on a boat, it has to look the same on both sides, or it's just not, you can tell, it just doesn't look right. If you look at any one of these, they've got that quality. And then there are things just that we call folk art. That boat's not really meant to look a whole lot like a boat. The portholes aren't quite right, the railings aren't quite right, not compared with some of those builders models we saw earlier. This one actually has a motor in it, radio controlled thing. I think the guy had more fun getting the motor and that stuff working than the time he spent on the model itself. We've got a wonderful model. It was done by a 12-year-old kid. He lived up in Marysville, and it was of one of the ferries that went back and forth between Marysville and Sombra, which would have been Marine City and Sombra. And it's a beautiful model for a 12-year-old. He did a great job, and as a piece of art, as a piece of folk art, it's a wonderful piece to have in the collection. Nowhere as detailed as some of the other models, but you got to appreciate them for what each of their qualities are. As far as museum interpretation, they're wonderful. They're really low tech. The bulb doesn't burn out on them. They don't. Kids, we've got them all behind glass. These are exceptions, and these are not on display very often. They're all behind glass, and so you can get right up close to them. And the detailing on them is really, really fine. They also have the ability in interpreting things that are huge to a smaller scale. This is the Gothic room down at the museum. It's the men's smoking lounge out of the city of Detroit 3, which people have maybe a hard time today conceptualizing how big the cruise ships were back then. But we've got a model that sits right in the middle of the thing, and they can walk up and see, and you can take somebody and point to these windows right along here and say that's where this room was. It's sat right there, and they can actually kind of envision being able to look out of the windows and see how the room worked. Yeah?
The woodwork that's there, I've been down there to see it. It's magnificent to see. Is that actually from the vessel?
Yep. They scrapped. It's the only one that they actually scrapped. All of the other DNC boats and some of the White Star boats, they towed up into Lake St. Clair, loaded them with tires and fuel oil, and set them on fire. It was the quickest way to get rid of them. They burned them down to the metal hulls, took the hull back, and scrapped the hull. This one they actually took a year and a half taken apart. I'm sure they lost a lot of money on it. A guy down in Ohio bought the main salon, he bought a couple of staterooms, he bought the Gothic room, and he bought the ladies' lounge. And he was going to recreate the inside of the boat at his farm. He owned a big paint company, so he was wealthy. He was going to recreate it inside a barn and down on his farm, and died before he could do that. I thought his wife made him sell it, but he died. So in getting rid of it, they sold it to Stofers, who bought the whole thing for like $18,000. And we're putting the different pieces in their different restaurants. And we found out about it just after the Dawson opened, and we went and kids sent in pennies. We raised money. We paid them $12 grand for just the one room. So they did pretty well on that deal. And it took about a year to redo the whole room and get it installed. And it really is spectacular. It's the last example of Great Lakes Steamboat Gothic that is out there. So.
Were these boats
This one was launched in 1914, which is the year the Titanic sank, or the year after, I guess. And then it ran up till 1950, and they were public transportation. They started off as necessary transportation before roads became much better, you know, but starting about 1920, they became more cruise ships, and they'd take people up to Mackinac. Their general run, this boat was here to Buffalo and back, you know, honeymoons and class trips, or you get the train to New York. That was the best way to get the train to New York. And elegant, absolutely elegant ways of traveling. The staterooms were real bare. They were real bare. You had a sink, and you had a basic bed or a bunk bed. Because you're expected to spend all your time, people spent their time out in the public spaces, and the public spaces were spectacular. That other cutaway model that I showed earlier on that showed the interior, you know, that was another D&C boat and just showed the elegance that those boats had. You know, and I'd never be able, we can get the one room into a museum, but with that model, I can get the whole boat into the museum. That's probably the best part. Another thing we do is most of the models at the Dawson were made to a 1/8 scale, so that 1 inch equals 8 feet, I believe is how that works out. It's not really a 1/8 scale, but that's what they call it. And because they're all made to the same scale, I can show, when a class trip comes in, I can show this boat, which was the Griffin, you know, LaSalle's Griffin, the first European vessel on the lakes, and it's about this long. You know, and then we can step into the next room and we can talk about the pilot house of the William Clay Ford and, you know, show them what a real pilot house looks like and talk about the story of it and the Edmund Fitzgerald. The Ford went out after the Fitzgerald when they heard it sunk. They went out to see if there was anything it could do. Into the storm. Same storm. They steamed right into it. Went right over the top of the boat. It's a great story. We've got the pilot house, we've got the anchor from the Fitzgerald, and then we've got some interpretation. We've got a beautiful model of the Fitzgerald built to the same scale. So when you compare the Griffin, is this long, with the Fitzgerald model, which is about 7 feet long, you know, kids can really see, or anybody can see, you know, how the ships have developed. And, you know, vessels like the Philo Parsons here, you know, comparable scale, so that you can still see that the Griffin would have fit in, you know, basically from the bow to the pilot house. And, you know, the Philo Parsons, even though a small boat, was a whole lot bigger than the Griffin was, and then things like this came afterwards. We've also got a nice model that shows the William Clay Ford, so you can point to the pilot house and say, this is what you're actually standing in. And the model is set up in such a way that it has the wreck of the Fitzgerald underneath it, and you can actually see what happened that night. So from an interpretive, and this all takes up 5 feet of a relatively small museum. So it, you know, the modeling can really help with the interpretation. We've also got in the same space, you know, one of the ore docks that they've got up north. And this one, and I just found this out last week, if you plug it in, it actually works. They've got little belts and stuff that load the ore up and move the train back and forth, and nobody ever told me that. I don't think it's ever operated, but it does actually work. Harvey Nisley built this one, and one of the finer model builders, although he's probably at the end of his career. But a model like this, you can help explain, you know, here's the little trains coming across the top, they empty into the hopper empties into the ship, and you can load a boat in a couple of hours. You know, real nice interpretive piece. You know, what does a quadruple expansion steam engine look like? Well, I'd love to put one in the museum. I don't have room. So the model works real well. We did an underwater exhibit recently and talked about the Alvin Clark, which is a boat that sank over in Green Bay, and made a great story. They brought the Clark up, some divers brought it up, tried to turn it into a museum, went broke, the boat rotted to pieces and fell apart, which is why if we find a boat, we now leave it on the bottom. Great story to tell, and it was nice to have not only parts of the Alvin Clark, that door there and some of the tools were from the Clark, but we also had a model of the Clark that showed what the ship looked like when it was sailing. And then Ted McCutcheon, who had gone and done the measurements on the boat, actually built the cabin of the Alvin Clark to show the stuff that we've got. We've got the table, we've got the captain's desk, we've got both of the stoves, we've got some of the crockery. You know, so all this stuff is sitting right there, and people could turn around and look at the model and see where it would have sat within the boat. I mean, as an interpretive piece, it was incredible. Beautiful to have. I mean, just the detail and the size of how these guys lived, how sailors lived on a schooner. The process. There's the hard way and there's the easy way, as with everything. The hard way is the way they would actually build a boat. We would actually start by building the frames, and this is a beautiful cutaway of the Munson. You know, you actually start with the frames, and then you put the plating over it, just as you would have seen in that earlier model. And you can see inside and see how the self-unloading system works. And so you get an idea of not only the outside, but the inside of the boat. There are some spectacular models built this way, especially of some of the old British warships. You know, where you can see all of the scantlings and all of the knees and all of the framing and exactly how strong the ships were. They really did a beautiful job. These models like this take, you know, a good year if you're working on them every day. The alternative is to not carve out the whole hull and just work on the outside of the boat. And this is kind of a process that Harvey Nisley walked through, and he's building a cabin cruiser here. You know, and you take those plans, the plans that I showed you earlier, you reproduce them, you cut out the pieces, you lay them down, you know where to cut off the bow, you know how to get rid of the excess wood, and pretty soon you've got, you know, something that starts to resemble a boat. You know, you kind of sand it down, and the tools are basically woodworking tools. Only many of them are much smaller than, you know, you use smaller saws. Dental picks are very handy for this kind of stuff. Lots of sandpaper and patience. You know, you sand it down till you get the proper shape. He put a keel down the center of this just so he could get the ridge right. Put the two halves together, tag a transom on it. I'm making this sound so easy, aren't I? You know, he gets it all sanded, and then he starts building the cabin up. Putting in the pieces as necessary. Getting the sides, building out the windows. Next comes the flying bridge. Then he paints it all. He's been building some of the furniture off to the side, putting on some of the trim work. He's got the anchor platform on the bow there now. There goes the refrigerators in and the seats. Got to have refrigerators. And then some of the superstructure. And you got a really nice model. You know, and he's saved a whole lot of time by using the solid hull method of just starting from the outside, because this model isn't intended to look inside. You know, a scratch-built model with all of the framing and stuff that takes a year, you're going to pay thousands and thousands of dollars for those. Really well-built models, $60,000, $70,000 easily. You know, a model like this, Harvey can afford to sell for $2,000 or $3,000. You know, he can turn something like this out in, well, probably in 2 weeks, but he'd probably be building 3 or 4 of them at a time. So they're much easier, much quicker for a modeler to do, and frankly, for most guys who want this to sit on their desk at work, or ladies who want this to sit on their mantle at home, you know, that's perfectly acceptable. We're going to run through a real quick building of a sailboat. He's cut out the cockpit, got in the keel there, starting to fill in the sides. Getting some of the paint, the windows carved, some of the deck hardware added, the dorades. Adds the teak. Now you're getting into the little fine details, the tow rails, the masts, the hatches. And a beautiful model. I mean, the detail on those is absolutely incredible. Here's where I brag a little bit. We have got the largest collection of vessels related to the Great Lakes in the world. We got lucky enough to get a head start on a lot of people. There's some beautiful collections around. Mariners Museum, the Mystic Seaport Museum, You know, I said we got 150. They've probably got 1,500. They've got thousands of models, but they're all ocean boats. You know, as far as the Great Lakes goes, we've got that nailed. They've got a nice collection down in Vermilion. They've got a real nice collection over in Manitowoc. But we still do well here. These are some of the early boats. This would have been the Welcome. Anybody who was up in Mackinac might remember this. This boat now sails out of Traverse City. You can take a trip on this one if you want to. It's a Revolutionary War era sloop. This would have been one of the boats. This is the Niagara, yeah, from the War of 1812. I was going to try to bring this model, but it just it's a little too delicate to be traveling in my station wagon. But a beautiful model. The Walk in the Water. You know, the very first steamboat running on the Upper Lakes, built over in Black Rock, had to actually get towed out of the Niagara River because it didn't really have much power. The engines were real new, but you can see that they're pretty Spartan. I mean, there are no above deck cabins. You know, everything was down below, and then you can see how much space those engines took up. You know, between the boilers and the engine and the cordwood that it took to fuel it, you lost half of the vessel. I mean, as far as a cargo carrier, not so good. As far as getting people someplace on time, worked great. Michigan was also a beautiful boat. They did have upper deck cabins. They had 2 engines, so it took up even more space, but it ran much faster, ran on time. There's another, we've actually got 2 models of the Michigan. That's the same thing. You can see it's got 2 rockers here in the center. These things here, this would be attached to the cylinder on the engine. This would be attached to the paddle wheel, and those rockers would go back and forth like a teeter-totter. And this one was designed, and it wasn't the only one they did this on, but it wasn't very successful. They put in 2 engines, figuring, you know, that if you wanted to turn, you made one engine go a little bit faster. Wanted to turn really fast, you made the other one go in reverse. You know, that was a great idea. The hard part was getting the 2 of them running at the same speed when you were going straight ahead. So they never tried that one again. This is the other Michigan. This is the Navy boat. It was the first iron-hulled boat in the U.S. Navy. Actually was rolled. They rolled the plates down in Pittsburgh, took them apart, shipped them up to Erie, put them back together, and it operated, from I think 1844 until 1939. It was just in business for a long time. For a long time, it was the fastest boat in the U.S. Navy. You know, it was involved in the King Strang affair up on Beaver Island. It was involved in some of the mine riots up in the UP. It was guarding Johnson Island. In fact, it and the Philo Parsons have a story that goes back. Mayflower, this is the oldest model in our collection. This model was actually built when the boat was sailing, which would have been 45 to 52. The little round disc on the front there was a medal that it won at the Michigan State Fair in 1951, 52. So that it's a beautiful model. It's in beautiful shape. The detail's not quite as good as the builder's models, but the fact that it was made at the same time that the boat was sailing, and we don't have any photographs. I mean, they didn't have photographs at that point of these vessels, so just having that kind of thing is a wonderful thing to have. The Philo Parsons Civil War era boat, and in fact, that's right here. This is what it looked like about 3 months ago before I took it to Harvey Nisley. And then Harvey tenderly took it down and got it repainted and made it look almost new again. This one, oddly enough, is made mostly out of metal, out of sheet bronze. And paint doesn't like sticking to it. So after, I think this is about a 1935 model, after enough years, the paint just started coming off, and it took Harvey the time to put it back together. Great story about this boat. It was commandeered by Confederates out of Detroit. They took it out of Detroit, and they were going down to try to capture the Michigan, which we just talked about, the Navy boat, try to capture the Michigan and free all the prisoners at Johnston's Island that were down there in northern Ohio in Sandusky. They got the boat, they went down and kind of cruised around a little bit, realized they were running out of wood, went over to rewood. They then cruised a little bit more. and then they backed down. They realized they didn't have enough people. They had probably already, in fact, they had already roused suspicion on the Michigan. They had a Confederate on the Michigan who was supposed to help them take it over. He got caught, and they ended up bringing the boat back. And it's one of those wonderful stories. If you ever get a chance, dig up the story on the Philo Parsons. It's pretty funny. We can show how the boats started expanding. You know, little by little they got longer. We can show how, smokestacks weren't necessarily always one in front of each other like we see them now. The hogging arches that they had to add to stiffen up the boats, as they got longer. This is the Challenge, which was the early prototype of a Great Lakes schooner. And then the schooners got bigger. Now, if you ever decide to dig into a sailboat, think about it, because a freighter's a whole lot easier to make than a sailboat. Just the rigging itself takes a lot of time. And then if you want to put sails on it, you're adding a whole nother element. This was the David Dow's. This was the biggest of the Great Lakes schooners. 5 masts, way too long, couldn't get into any harbor. It only sailed for about 3 or 4 years before they just turned it into a barge, which is really too bad because it probably looked great when it was sailing. And then we start getting into a classic, the classic freighters. They get longer, they get hatches, they get the guy, the helmsman is up in the bow. Packet ships. This is one of the Ford boats. This is the Benson Ford, which is a beautiful boat. Henry Ford used it as kind of his personal yacht. There was actually a separate deck up in the front for the Fords. Had its own galley. They had a special elevator they used that they'd put over the side to get Mrs. Ford onto the boat. But it's nice to have a yacht like that. If you want to go to your UP property, it's a nice way to go. This is a real nice model that we just pulled out of storage. And then, pretty much up to the modern ones. And some of the old tugs. This is one of the more popular ones to do as a model because it's relatively small. It's about this long. The plans are not very complicated, and you get a really nice response. Old lumber hooker. I mean, and that's the best part is we've got models. Here's one of the pig boats, the cigar boats they called them. Whalebacks was the official name. Built up in Duluth, and they were basically a cigar-shaped boat. The idea was that the waves would just kind of wash over them. It was a great idea. It didn't work very well. They were really hard to unload, which was a problem, but they worked. The one model we don't have, it's the Christopher Columbus, which sailed out of Chicago for the World's Fair in '93 for a long time, and it was built as a whaleback, the only passenger whaleback. And this model is probably just after contemporary to the boat, so it's probably about a 1910 version of the boat. Beautiful, beautiful model. Frank Kirby, who is the architect I talked about earlier, actually had a boat named after him that he designed. This was built by the same guy who built the Philo Parsons, and it's looking like it could use a little help too. The guy who built these actually did put a motor inside of them. So if you have the motor rigged, the paddle wheels will turn and the walking beam will go back and forth. They've both been disabled at this point. Nice to have. Most of us remember the Columbia, again a Frank Kirby boat, one of the Boblo boats that ran forever, and the South American, the last of the Great Lakes cruise ships that used to run. Made its last runs in 1967 when it went down to Montreal for the Expo 67 down there. And then it went off to be a dormitory in New Jersey, which never happened. It ended up just kind of sitting there and rotting for years. And luckily, a bunch of people from the Dawson went out and salvaged all kinds of stuff off the South American too, because we had the ability to do that. That the train ferries that ran across the river forever. This would have been an oil carrier, petroleum carrier that ran for Steinbrenner. We've got some of the military vessels. This was the Antic, which was built 1861. Some people have said that it was supposed to be Lincoln's yacht, his presidential yacht. but there really isn't any corroborating evidence to suggest that. Either way, soon after it was built, this war had started. So it got turned into a gunboat and spent the Civil War as a gunboat. After the Civil War, it sailed around the world a couple of times for the U.S. Navy, and then it ended up at the Broadhead Marina, or the Broadhead Naval Armory, right there by the Belle Isle Bridge, where it was a training ship for years and years in Detroit, until it sank right there at its moorings. They took the boilers out and put them in the Broadhead to keep the Broadhead, and then they put a parking lot over the top of it. So it's still down there if you really were into an architectural project or an archaeological project. You could do that. The Mariposa, one of the Coast Guard buoy tenders. This was the Dubuque. Dubuque was a Navy vessel that was manned by Michiganders and spent a lot of time showing the flag on the Great Lakes. We've got some yachts besides the one Harvey has made. This was the Eureka, which was Aaron DeRoy's boat. And the DeRoy family, we've got DeRoy Hall down at the museum. There's a DeRoy Auditorium at Wayne State. He was a GM finance guy very early on, made a lot of money, got into cars, got into real estate. And Eureka is A. DeRoy spelled backwards. But it really, one of the beautiful boats that used to sail around the Great Lakes. Kept it at the Detroit Yacht Club. Besides having the models to work with, we've got just a wonderful collection. I mentioned that we opened at the time everything else was closing, so we were able to get all kinds of things. The lake fleet has downsized so that people, as they retired, were giving us their instruments, their sextants. The Lake Survey Office was based in Detroit that made all the charts of the lakes when they closed. We got charts and instruments from them. The U.S. Lighthouse Service was based in Detroit. The 11th District was based here. When they moved it to Cleveland, we got all kinds of stuff. They were selling lenses in barrels. You could buy a barrel of lighthouse lenses. Because the Dawson was one of 3 maritime museums when it opened, all of the captains made sure that we had their house flags, we had their personal flags. We got a wonderful collection of burgees. The power boaters, the Dawson family, were big into power boats. The hydroplanes. So we've got an incredible collection of hydroplane memorabilia, and some of the underwater stuff we've done. They went out and after the Edmund Fitzgerald sank, some guys remembered that the Fitzgerald had dropped an anchor right down at the foot of Belle Isle. They had gone to anchor one day when they were waiting on a wind. When they were done anchoring, they pulled up the anchor chain and there was no anchor at the bottom of it. And after the boat sank, our divers went out and found it, recovered it, and it now sits at the museum. Recently, we were involved in the recovery of that cannon that came out of the river. Detroit police divers found it. We've found 6 cannons so far, probably dating to the time when the British turned the city over to the Americans. And those cannon were all redundant, so the best way they could get rid of them so that the Americans couldn't use them, dump them in the river. We've been able to find them. There's all kinds of stuff on the bottom of the Detroit River. So it's just nice having the ability to pull all these things together into the Dawson. It's really quite an asset to town. A lot of people don't know it's there, but then again, a lot of people don't know that the Belle Isle's there. I was at Cheyne Park for a graduation a few years ago, and as we were walking out, the woman in front of me was saying, "I can't believe how beautiful this is, and they've got a river." And you could tell she had lived in town her whole life, and she just never quite got it. So I enjoy coming out and talking about this stuff and getting people more and more interested in it as we go. The Detroit Historical Society took over the city's historical assets about 6 or 7 years ago. The Detroit Historical Museum, the Dawson Great Lakes Museum, and a collection of things that we keep at Fort Wayne, about 250,000 things these are all part of that. We closed the museum, the main Detroit Historical Museum, about a month ago, and have absolutely gutted it, except for the streets of Old Detroit, which we haven't touched, can't touch, and one of our other permanent exhibits. The rest of the museum has been taken to the studs, and we're completely rebuilding a couple of the existing exhibits, and we're putting in 4 completely new exhibits, one about the Arsenal of Democracy, one about Detroit's kind of innovative bent, all the different innovators we've had, from people who have innovated in education to music to automobiles, obviously. A whole exhibit, our old round hall is becoming the Gallery of Culture, which is covering 20th century culture, 1900 to 2000, you know, everything from the incredible building boom we had in the 20s, right up, you know, through the wonderful years of the 1990s as we remember them. All kinds of new stuff happening there. We're going to reopen that museum in November. So look forward to all kinds of great publicity in November. We then close the Dawson Museum, and we'll be taking the whole main gallery, we'll take that one down to nothing and completely rebuild that out. We actually, you know, if I was to go back to that very first slide, see if I can do this without my glasses. There are things in that room that are still in that room 50 years ago. It's time we get that room changed, and it'll be really nice to take, you know, some of that stuff out, some of the things hanging from the ceiling that have been there for 50 years. They need to go away and relax for a little bit, and we can put some new stuff in. But that whole gallery is going to get a complete remake starting in December, and we'll reopen that museum in April. So this is a really exciting time to be part of the society, and it's great to be doing it. Yeah.
I have a question. My
Sure.
mother was fascinated by a ship, the Aquarama. Could you
Oh,
enlighten
yeah.
us on that thing?
What's that?
Could you
Oh,
enlighten us on that?
The Aquarama was a World War II cargo ship that was bought by the group. Anybody remember the Milwaukee Clipper? It used to be the Octorora, I think, or the Juniata. Juniata became the Milwaukee Clipper, ran from Muskegon over to Milwaukee. It got too old. They wanted to replace it, so they bought the Aquarama to do that. Unfortunately, the Aquarama was fast built, really quickly, single screw, lots of freeboard, which means that it stuck up in the air a long way and could get blown around real easily. Wasn't very maneuverable, which on the lakes and rivers around here, it was tough. The company that bought it and put it together still exists. They're in business. They run a sand company, and based in Grosse Pointe. They got it going. They couldn't get Milwaukee to dredge deep enough to get it into the Milwaukee harbor. So they brought it around to Detroit and ran Detroit to Cleveland for a long time. But because it wasn't very maneuverable, the poor guy who ran it, great captain, I've heard nothing but nice things about him, but they called him Captain Crash because he'd go into Cleveland and, you know, he'd go to turn the boat and he'd run into one of the bars on the front or a warehouse. He actually ran into Windsor turning out of Detroit one time. The boat, it wasn't his fault, it was the boat. It was a tough boat to sail. It really was a tough boat to sail. It was very cool. They then took it back to Muskegon because that's where the company was based at the time. They turned it into kind of a hotel. They wanted to renovate it and get it up and running as a tourist attraction. And that didn't happen. So then it got towed to Sarnia, and then it got towed to Windsor, and then it got towed to Toledo, and then it got towed to Buffalo. And when the Buffalo City Council finally said, you got to do something with that, then they scrapped it. And that was about 2 years ago. So that was, it was, yeah, an unfortunate end to a real nice boat. So.
Thank you.
Russell has a question.
Yes, sir.
When is that thing going to open again?
When is it going to open? Well, it's open right now. So if you want to go see all of those cool models that I just showed, you can go until Christmas.
Okay.
And then we'll close it in Christmas, and it'll reopen just after next Easter.
Okay.
Does that work? Okay. That's good. I'll leave all those great models out so you can see them.
And look at this. Is this for you?
Did you do a good picture? Is that for me? Wow, you're such a great guy. That's beautiful. That's wonderful. I'm glad you were paying attention. That's a good thing.